This is Senator Gene Yaw. Welcome to A Conversation with Gene Yaw. Today, we are going to tour the EaglesMereAirMuseum, located in the middle of Sullivan County in EaglesMere. This is something, if you know anything about classic old aviation planes, you need to see. We will be talking with George Jenkins and Karen Heisman to explain the background of this museum and what we have on display here. So stay tuned.
The background on this is that I started to build an airport so that I could get from New York, where I worked, to EaglesMere, where my family was on the weekends. And that morphed into...
That's an extreme solution to a problem there.
It is. I'm inclined that way. But I started collecting old airplanes, and the collection grew, and we started off with one hangar, and then we ended up with two hangars, and we got to a point of deciding that we should open this up to the public. And it's sort of a concept of anything worth doing is worth doing to excess. And so when we go around, Karen will point this out, we have a lot of exhibits on women pilots. And the reason we have these exhibits about women pilots is that I got very frustrated when I first opened up that the men would come in, they'd wander around, they'd ask lots of questions. The women would sit outside, largely on the benches that we had, and there was no engagement. And it occurred to me that they just didn't understand what the women in period were doing. They were winning major races. They were flying across the Atlantic shortly after Lindbergh had flown across the Atlantic. They were some of the first to fly the Pacific. They set world records in altitude and a lot of different things. So we went to work and we collected a lot of exhibits and early photographs and trophies and licenses, and we put it all together. And I would say, what do we get, about 95% conversion of women at this point?
Wow.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Wander around.
They love the different exhibits for the women.
And I guess last year we decided to work with the Wax Museum. And so we have a whole exhibit on the early World War II female pilots who were basically the backdrop to the manufacturing industry. So when planes, fighters, bombers came out of the factories, it was the women pilots who flew these things. They flew them across the ocean to England. They were unarmed. They had all the same skills as the men. And again, we're trying very hard to point this out. And we've evolved to the point that we have a bunch of the airplanes that were flown by some of these famous women, or the identical examples of the ones that were flown, because a lot of these planes are unique. There aren't any others.
What years do you concentrate on? There's a certain time period I know of your planes.
We start in 1916 as our earliest plane. We end up about 1942, but the concentration is really from about 1920 to 1935, and that's the golden age of flight. And that's when all these companies happened. It was like the automobile industry. Lots of invention occurred. We went from biplanes to monoplanes. We went from water-cooled engines to air-cooled radial engines. I mean, it was just a tremendous amount of activity going on.
But just out of curiosity, I mean, we're in EaglesMere in the middle of Sullivan County, which Sullivan County is noted for the fact is 6,400 people, one traffic light, two Olympians. Two Olympians. I mean, how did you get here? Why did you pick this area?
Well, I got here because we got attracted to EaglesMere, and my family was up here, and I like projects. And so once I had learned how to fly, and I learned how to fly in Williamsport, I then went trying to find an airport. The town wouldn't sell me their airport. Ultimately, I ended up buying their airport, so I own both. So I had to build my own airport. So that was a project, and I built the airport. And you could do this as a beautiful rural environment. It was perfect. And So that's more or less how it happened.
Well, your comment, anything worthwhile doing is worthwhile doing to excess. I'd like to say, just from standing here looking around, and I know we're going to tour this, that it looks to me like anything worthwhile doing is worthwhile doing at a top-notch professional level, because just standing here and looking at some of these planes, they're really well preserved, and I think they all fly.
Yeah, they all fly, and the other piece of this is the state was helpful to me. I needed more runway length, and I was able to engage with the right people in the state, and we ultimately did a land swap. It was financially very beneficial for the state. They got a key piece of land that I paid a lot of money for, but I got a critical 26 acres that I needed to extend my runway, and so everybody was very happy in the process. So it's been a joint effort.
And you have an active runway here. I mean, that people
two runways
that people actually fly into.
They do.
Come here to Eaglesmere.
Exactly.
Karen, if you would show us around.
Absolutely.
What you have here.
This is a radial engine. It's a 9-cylinder, 300 horsepower radial.
And I notice it's a Lycoming.
It's a Lycoming engine. It was built in about, I would think, 1930-ish, in that vicinity. Radials are always an odd number of cylinders because of the way they need to balance. This is a cutaway engine. If you notice, the top part of this engine is cutaway. If you go to the side of it, you can see how the master rods and different parts of the engine do work. This engine was located by a retired Army colonel in a junkyard. He took it apart and restored it, cut away the top part of those radial, and that's, as you see it working today. It's a really nice presentation of a radial engine.
That's a great demonstration unit, and there was a lot of work put in just
absolutely. We have one of our planes that's a 1942 Stearman that we do fly also, that has another Lycoming engine that's working.
Very good.
The radials became popular in the latter part of the 20s, in through the 30s, till other types of engines took over. This was a precursor to a radial engine. This is actually a rotary engine. The rotary engines, this particular engine is a Larone engine. It was built in about the plane was built in Bath, New York, Ithaca, in that vicinity, in about 1918. But we think that this particular engine is about 1930.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's everything rotates to keep the engine cool with the rotary engine. This is our only plane that we have a rotary in, but we do have other rotaries on display. We have a really amazing display of very unusual and rare engines.
Very good.
We also have an Anzani fan-type engine. This is a 1908. This is one of our oldest engines. I'll take our little project away here. This engine actually hung, or was in a plane that hung in the atrium of the Wanamaker store in Philadelphia. Mr. Wanamaker was very much into aviation, and this was one of these, the engine in a Berlioz plane, which was one of the original.
What's unique about this?
It was an Italian engine, was built in Italy, and it's one of, I believe, only 3 that were ever built. We do have a World War II display. This display showcases the Women's Air Service pilots. These women flew from 1942 through 1944. They were based out of Sweetwater, Texas, Avenger Field. And these particular women not only acted as pilots, ferrying the planes throughout the United States, they were their own mechanics, as you can see in some of the pictures. They were navigators, and then they had fun too. Most of these women came from the north or from in and around the middle part of the United States, so they had never experienced anything in Texas. So these are just some photos of women that really experiencing Texas life, the Texan life.
I noticed on the entrance road out there, there was a picture of Rosie the Riveter.
Rosie the Riveter. These were the comparison to Rosie the Riveter.
Okay.
These ladies never received any recognition until 1977 from the government. They were considered to be civil pilots. so they never were given any type of recognition. They needed more hours in the air than the men did, or as many hours in the air as the men did. They had to go through everything that the men did during that time, the basics and things, basic training. And they were on in Texas at this field where they had to pay for everything for themselves. They were not given their uniforms. They had to pay for their own way to the field. They also, if there were a few women that were killed during this time period, their families had to pay for their bodies to be sent home because the government didn't recognize them as such.
Any idea how many total number of women pilots of this type were involved?
I believe they 1,700 applied, and I think that there were maybe about 12 or 1,300 that actually did this type of work. There were quite a few in Williamsport, actually.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there were. I don't know their names, but when people come in, they, oh, my aunt did this, or my aunt, you know, and when we ask where they're from, there were quite a few in Williamsport that served during that time period. They're also in, for the Piper aircraft, which is in Lock Haven,
right.
There was a group of women that were called the Grasshopper Girls. And these particular girls, or women, I should say, ferried planes for Piper aircraft also.
Okay. Well, show us some of the planes you have.
Sure will. This is a 1929 Pitcairn Super Mail Wing. This particular plane was built outside of Philadelphia in Brenathan, Pennsylvania. Willow Grove Field, which is now, Willow Grove is now used by, or used to be used by the Air Force. The engine that's on this plane, which is really an amazing engine, is called a Wright J5 engine. This particular engine is the same type of engine that was used by Lindbergh when he flew across the Atlantic Ocean. The mail carriers would fly 24/7. They never actually stopped. You know, they would fly in all kinds of weather, and they were paid by the pound, not by how many satchels they would deliver. It was by poundage of what they would carry. There is an identical one to this Pitcairn hanging in the Smithsonian Institute also.
Is this propeller, is that a piece of standard equipment? I see it,
Yes,
it says,
it was built out, came from Pittsburgh. Some of these planes that are here, some of them have the steel, some of them have wood coated, some of them are tapered with some copper around the edges to help protect the propellers also.
And what year is this plane?
It's in 1929, and at that time period, if you look at this plane cost about $8,500 to build new. At that time period in 1929, with everything that was going on in the country, you could have bought 3 or 4 houses in a city for that amount of money. The Pitcairn Company named themselves Eastern Air Transport. They later became Eastern Airlines.
Oh, wow. Can we walk around the side
Sure.
of it over here?
Absolutely.
Is this a metal or fabric?
These are all built from wood. Everything that you see, it looks like it's metal, but it's actually a wooden base, as well as the actual piece itself for the
And then what's the
fuselage.
covering?
The covering is a cotton synthetic type material that's put on here on the actual wooden frame. It's steamed to adhere to the wood, and then once it's adhered to the wood, they used to hand stitch. Now they must have some type of a stitching machine, but if you look kind of on the, you can see the stitches.
Okay.
And then a piece of material is put down over top of it to hold it, and sometimes around the edges to help hold it too. And
you can see the seams in it.
yeah,
here.
you can see the seams in the ribs. They're all the way across. Then they put what is called an airplane dope over top of it. And they can have as many as 10, 12 coats. It depends on what type of finish you want. Sometimes it was just a color coat on there, but it sounds like a drum. It's hollow inside.
Yeah. I mean, it's beautiful.
They're hollow, and the pilots always sat in the back seat. And the reason being,
There was no front seat?
well, there
was
could be a front seat in there,
Or
but
was
that's
that
where the
they
mail.
That's where they put the mail.
That's where the mail would go. But the pilots, if you notice, in a lot of the other biplanes, they always sit in the back for stability and for balance. This is actually one of a kind. It was there were 3 of these that were originally built. the taper wing, if you notice, it's a
Oh.
taper wing, and there were three that were originally built with this type of strut, and this is the only one that's left for this. This was built or used by Freddie Lund, who was a stunt pilot. He flew in a lot of air circuses, which is what they called at the time.
What was the purpose of this type of strut
I'm not sure on that.
versus those?
Aerodynamics, okay. It was for aerodynamics. And this is called a pita tube, that's for the airspeed and such. And this is called a javelin, which holds so that the pieces don't vibrate.
That's a pretty simple solution.
It's just a piece of
Yeah.
wood that is done there.
If you know, what's the speed of some of these planes? Like
It's, let me see, it can cruise at 137 miles.
okay.
We have a case that's dedicated to the women. There's so many different women, it's hard to even go into anything. In 1929, there was a powder puff derby, it was called. It was an all-women's air race, which took place. There's just so many different women that actually worked. Bessie went to France to get her license in I think it was 1910, 1920. And the reason she went to France was twofold. One, she was African American, but the biggest was she was a woman. So when she came back, she started her own air circus. Of course, we have Amelia Earhart, and there's just so many to even talk about. Poncho had, it was called the Happy Bottom Riding Club, which was out in where Miramar Field is, I believe now. Nancy Harkness Love was one of the people that developed the WASP program along with Jackie Cochran. Jackie was an amazing pilot, and the two of those the two women got together and developed this along with Eleanor Roosevelt, who had gone to England, seen what was happening in England with the female flying and different things for the RAF, and came back, and with these two women's help, the WASP developed. And Harriet was, she was a very beautiful woman, but they called her the darling. There's just so many. And Eleanor Smith is a really interesting story. We have a plane that I want to show you as we go around.
On your website, I remember her.
Eleanor.
In the plane.
She was 16 when she received her license. And at the age of 17, on a dare from friends, she flew under all the bridges of New York City up the Hudson River. So she was arrested when she landed. She did get arrested, but her family was very wealthy, so they were able to make some amends, I guess. But she went on to be an amazing pilot. She didn't fly in the air derby, but she broke an awful lot of records. And these women at that time period had this camaraderie that one would set a record, then another one would break it. And it was a constant thing, but it was a friendly
competition.
Absolutely, yes.
Well,
But
sure. Show us the plane. I'd love to see that
okay, sure.
plane.
Let's go over here. This Waco is a 1929, and if you notice when we talked about different types of engines, this engine has an OX5 engine in it, and it's like a V8, and this is its radiator.
Really?
It needs a radiator because it's water cooled.
Okay.
So this plane exactly identical to this is the one that she would have flown in underneath of all the bridges.
It's quite a plane.
It is a beautiful plane. One of our other planes that we have, which is the only one that's left still, and we could fly it if we wanted to, is this Cessna. It's a 1928 Cessna. This particular Cessna, as I said, is the only one that's left.
This one?
Absolutely, yes. And if you notice the difference between this plane and some of the others, it's not a biplane.
Yeah.
It's a one-wing plane or a monoplane, but it doesn't have any struts helping hold the wing up. If you look around, there's other ones that help hold the wing up. When Mr. Cessna decided to build this plane, he wanted something fast, he wanted something different. This wing is a 40-foot wingspan, and it's cantilevered in the inside to give it more support inside of the actual cockpit. If you look at these pictures here, Mr. Cessna decided to, so he could get his licensing for these types of planes, put his workers on top of the wing, along with sandbags. It was 14,000 pounds plus, or 15,000 pounds. And then once he realized it would not crack or break up, he put it onto the plane, and then he had his workers stand on top of it. A lot of the kids that come in think this is photoshopped.
Yeah.
They think it's a hoax, but this is actually from a book.
That looks like a very small engine compared to what some of it is.
Compared to some of them, it is, yeah. But it was enough to support this. This would hold 4 people. Inside of the actual cockpit, which we could probably look at, it's a backward compass, which would be there.
Okay.
That one's not actually a backward one, but it would have been a backward compass, so that a pilot could look at probably a mirror to see which direction they would be going in.
Now, all these planes here, even the one over here that we looked at before, they fly.
They can be flown, yeah.
That's amazing.
Some of them we choose not to fly, but they
Well, I
could be
would
flown.
assume for historical purposes. You wouldn't want to.
Especially this one that's next to you. This is a 1917. This is one of our older planes. We have 2 that are 1917. We have this particular plane, which is called, it's named the Polson Special. It's a one of a kind. This particular plane was built by a World War I pilot by the name of Earl Doherty. Earl came back from the war and decided he still wanted to fly, as most of the pilots that came back did. And he built this plane with his butler, whose last name was Polson, so that's why the Polson Special. This has a OX-5 engine in it. And the reason that we have the plastic bags on is because it doesn't matter whether a plane's been flown or not, there's still always a residue. So that's just to protect the floor. But these planes could not be flown too far without the pilot landing and re-greasing all of those levers.
Those are all the valves, right?
The valves, correct, yes. And this is water cooled. This is the radiator in the front, again.
How many, is this 8-cylinder?
It's 8-cylinder. Mm-hmm. This plane was built from redwood. So when Earl Doherty was killed in a plane crash with another person, his widow kept this plane and one other plane from his collection, and kept it in a hangar until she died at 102. It's like for airspeed.
That's the speedometer?
Mm-hmm. It's like airspeed.
So how fast you're going and pushing against that indicates how fast.
Absolutely,
what your
yeah.
speed.
Mm-hmm. There's just so many. There's not enough time to go into each particular plane. There's just so many of them.
This is a very small one.
This is a small one. This is a Heath Henderson Parasol. It's a prototype. It's a 1926 prototype. This actually has excuse me. It has a motorcycle engine, 4-cylinder motorcycle engine that is made to do a airplane engine.
Wow.
These were kit planes. They were built from a kit. And the Henderson company was a motorcycle company and really encouraged people when they bought their kits to use a motorcycle engine. The plane that's up above, the red and black plane, is also a Heath Henderson. That's a little older. And that has a different type of engine in it.
The Heathkit company pioneered
the
fact that you could buy an airplane in pieces.
Yep.
And so you'd buy phase 1 of a kit, phase 2 of a kit, phase 3, and by the time you got done, you had a complete airplane. Ultimately, they went out of business in the late 30s, and it morphed into the Heathkit Radio Company. And the Heathkit Radio Company came about because of all the surplus radio parts during World War II.
Yeah.
And so they're one and the same by brand name.
Yeah, I remember those now that you mention it, that you can buy all these different things and do all kind of radio work. And I thought you could do other things besides radios too. That
I think they made walkie-talkie, anything that
Yeah.
was electronic,
Yeah.
they had these kits that you could put together,
Yeah.
which was fabulous.
This is Teddy. Teddy is our guard dog, greeting dog. He's not a guard dog. He's too nice to be a guard dog.
Maybe one finally, you might show them the Orville Wright's flag.
Sure.
Story.
Okay. This is over here. This in 1903, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk.
right.
And in 1909, there was a lot happening between the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss from Hammondsport, as well as other people that were in the process of building planes. So the Wright brothers went in 1909 to Europe. They decided they wanted to try to sell their patent to different governments. So they went to England. England was not involved. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. But he flew over Berlin, through the he went over to Berlin, went to visit the Kaiser, and then flew for the Kaiser in 1909. This happens to be the flag that flew on the Wright Flyer in 1909. It's signed by Orville Wright. And
Wow.
this was given to a friend of his sister's. And so she actually had that flag from 1909. And these different types of pictures and memorabilia is actually from Helen McFadden, who was, again, a friend of Orville's sister Catherine. And the USS Wright was the first aircraft carrier that was built during that time period. And this is a covering of a bottle, champagne bottle, from that particular.
Well, you mentioned the Curtiss Museum at Bath.
Yes, the Curtiss Museum.
Or at Hammondsport.
Hammondsport.
I mean, I've been there, and that's a fascinating
It is.
museum with the plane that they have outside and everything inside. But I never put it together, the Curtiss Wright. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where that came from.
Well, the Curtiss Company and the Wright Company actually did get together. I think it was in maybe the 30s,
Yeah.
1929. They did get together and do. That's when they started to manufacture together.
There's one I'd like to look at.
Sure.
What's this Thunderbird over here?
Oh, that has a great story too. The Thunderbird, that's the only one that is left. There were 19, I believe, of those, 18 or 19 originally built. This was actually owned by a World War I pilot by the name of Roscoe Turner. Roscoe Turner was very eccentric. He loved to race. He won many, many races. We have different copies of his race schedules and his goggles and helmet and everything. This plane was fitted by him in about 1929 or so with a parachute. Above the front seat, the wing was cut out and a parachute was installed in there with a charge. He took this plane to the altitude it was necessary to be able to set off the charge for the parachute. It did work. It did bring the plane down. Did some damage underneath. I think he got some broken bones and things, but it was the first time that had ever been attempted. And it was about 65 or so years after that happened that the government actually gave the okay or the approval for small planes and helicopters to have parachutes in them. And it saved many, many lives, those parachutes.
And this is the only one?
The only one that's left. This is an amazing plane. He also had one other thing that he loved to have was his pet lion. He had a lion that he flew with by the name of Gilmore. He worked for the Gilmore Oil Company, so he named his lion Gilmore. And Gilmore had his own parachute, and he flew with Roscoe until he became too large.
So where did Gilmore sit, in the back seat or the front seat?
I'm not sure where he would have sat or maybe held him, I'm not sure. But when he became too large, he put him out to pasture. And when Gilmore passed away of old age, he had him stuffed. Once he was stuffed and after Roscoe passed, He's somewhere in the Smithsonian Institute. I've tracked him down to that point with all the other planes that were in Roscoe's collection. He was an amazing stunt pilot and racer.
Well, this has been fascinating, Karen.
Well, thank you.
It's colorful, it's educational, and I mean, it's just looking at these planes and how well they're preserved and the fact that they all fly. It's really amazing, and it's a real credit to this facility and everything that you do here.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. It's a labor of love, really.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.